Okay, this is part two of the podcast I did with Anthony Kaldellis on the Byzantine Empire. Previous episode took us up to the Fourth Crusade, and with this episode we start with the Fourth Crusade and go on from there. As it's part two, I won't bother with too much introduction, and we'll just get straight to it.
Okay, I'm back.
So the problem with doing a podcast about the Eastern Roman Empire is that, well, one of the problems is that it lasted so long. So we're going to have to hurl ourselves forward in time. And we'll pass over the period which you covered in your book, Streams of Gold, Rivers of Blood, which is sort of the recovery of the Romans against the Arab, in fact, their eventual triumph over the Arab Caliphate. And I think for some time, some period of years, they became the hegemonic power in the region. Mm-hmm. And we're going to have to pass over to the Seljuk Turks arriving and the sort of catastrophic Battle of Manzikert, which opens the door and lets the Turks into Anatolia. And finally, we're going to pass over the Crusades, or at least the early Crusades, the first of which actually, I think, helps the Romans recover at least some of their lost territory.
Yes.
But the spot I want to sort of kick off this part of the podcast is the place I want to land is Fourth Crusade, which I'm interested in your take on this. I take to be the absolute key moment in the history of Byzantium, and perhaps the greatest catastrophe of the Roman world, and maybe the greatest catastrophe in the history of Christendom, whatever that exactly means. And so I may be overselling it, but could you tell me if you agree with that, and maybe just say what happened with the Fourth Crusade for people?
Yes, I think generally I would agree with that. It was certainly the biggest catastrophe that Constantinople faced in the millennial history of its existence as the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. And it precipitated, the Romans recovered from it partially, even for the most part afterwards, but they never fully recovered, and it kind of precipitated the final fall of the Eastern Empire. So yeah, the Fourth Crusade is, if you had to pin the blame for what happened subsequently on one event, it would be that. Not that you should be looking for one event. Historians, we should be looking for sort of general underlying sort of structural patterns. But yes, as an event, it was very destructive. What it was. It was one of a long series of crusades that had been launched during the 12th century. Crusading priorities had shifted from going right for Jerusalem to realizing that Egypt was probably strategically the most necessary target. So they were going to go to Egypt, and the military leaders who wanted to lead the crusade had contracted with the Venetians to build a fleet to take the crusading army to Egypt, which the Venetians did sort of promptly and professionally. The crusading leaders were so inept that they had failed to put in place mechanisms to bring the crusading soldiers to Venice, where they would, embark on these ships. Many of them just went off to the east on their own. It was crusades, for the most part, it's chaotic events where the leadership is kind of struggling to just maintain control over events. Anyway, so not enough people showed up. The leadership couldn't pay the Venetians the contract. To make a long story short, the leadership of the crusade decided to divert it to Constantinople because they knew that it had the money to pay the contract to Venetians. It was put differently, it's a straight up capitalist project. When you strip everything else away, and you shouldn't, there are other things going on, but it's basically a group contracts with the Venetians to build a fleet, and they owe them money, and then they can't pay them the money. But what the leadership has is an armed force. That's their asset. So then they use their asset to get their hands on the money to pay off the contract.
And was it ever open to the government of Constantinople to say, "Don't worry, we'll pay the Venetians. Off you go"?
No. the government in Constantinople at this time has no idea about these kinds of intricacies, the kinds of decisions that the Crusade leadership were making. And I should say that it's a straight up conspiracy. There's no question about this. There's a great deal of modern scholarship has tried to whitewash the Fourth Crusade, kind of ameliorate it and say, oh, no, there's nothing to see here, folks. These are just crusading types doing their best and, making hard decisions. No, that's just apologetics, and we're just awash in crusade apologetics in the last decades. I think that's waning now. I think the mania for depicting the crusaders as like warriors driven by love is kind of fading. But there's pretty clear evidence that a section of the leadership, not the Venetians were sort of doing their part as contracted in all of this. They're not making these kinds of decisions. There's a bunch of field marshals and counts, mostly sort of quote French, who are making these decisions. And a number of them had begun to think about diverting the crusade to Constantinople because of its riches before they knew that they would be unable to fulfill the contract with the Venetians. Also, the military situation had changed, whereby Egypt suddenly, so between the initial plans and the preparation of the fleet, Egypt had become a much less tempting target because it was ruled by Saladin's brother, who was like not to be messed with. And so there are sources that show how the leadership came around to this idea of, hey, can we go to Constantinople first and basically meddle in its politics? So we're just going to use a puppet and go meddle in its politics to get our hands on. And they even floated this idea to the Pope, who said, no, you will not do that. But they did it anyway. The Venetians are not innocent. The Venetians had, just a few years earlier, that same Doge had sworn an oath to Alexius III in Constantinople to protect his realm, et cetera, in exchange for some significant perks that he gave them. So he had already contracted with the Venetians that they would obviously be friends and allies of the Roman state, and obviously not attack it, but not even help its enemies. And they broke that. So this is, and they knew what they were doing when they decided to attack Constantinople. Now, there are all kinds of ways of rationalizing and legalizing all of this behavior. You got to remember that the core of crusading is armed violence against people of a different religion in order to promote some greater good that you, right? In that context, it's impossible to, conduct yourself in a legal way, whether by international treaties or agreements or even basic law. It's also very difficult to conduct yourself in a moral way. We'll set that aside. And so this context emerged whereby anything that was done that promoted the goals of the crusade, no matter how abstract or removed from, taking Jerusalem, could be justified as right or even lawful. So we're talking about a group of guys who were experts in producing legal pretexts for what they were doing. And they flooded the text that they wrote about this event with this shit. As Steve Bannon, they flooded the zone with shit about how everything that they did was perfectly justified and rationalized and so forth. And some modern historians will fall for that. I don't.
I think you're very hard, and I think for all, as far as I'm concerned, rightly so, about the Normans, who are absolute experts at,
yes.
at finding some charter underneath the bed, which explained why they were entitled to whatever kingdom it was that they wanted to take over.
Yeah, the standard mode was to find some puppet an actor, maybe. Just find an actor who's pretending to be the previous deposed emperor of Constantinople, and then posture as his champion, who's going to, restore him to his rightful throne. The Crusaders were doing the same thing. They had found a nobody who had no claim to the title of emperor, and they were like, we're going to restore him to his rightful throne. He never had that throne. He'd never been designated heir or successor or anything. So they just used these pretexts. And, basically, we saw the U.S. government do this in Iraq in 2003 with all of these puppet, claimants and exiled dissidents and fake reports of WMDs. And it's just, it must have felt a little bit like that, as certainly to the Romans. It's like, what is going on? Like, anyway, whatever.
I do feel you're a bit soft on the Venetians. I mean, they have this 85 or 86-year-old blind pope who's more or less first up over the walls. I mean, that seems like he's pretty committed.
Well, the reason I qualify what I say about the Venetians is because for a long time, scholarship tried to blame all of this on the Venetians.
Right.
And that created the opportunity for apologetic pushback, because you can, in fact, refute the thesis that the Venetians were the masterminds behind this. They weren't. They went along with it, and shamefully so, because they had to violate their own treaty with Alexius III, but they weren't the masterminds behind it. They went along with the masterminds. And the whole thing was a conspiracy, also in that they were keeping their plans from their own soldiers and gradually dribbling out their plans. When it became harder and harder for their soldiers to take off and leave, they were now we're stuck with this project. They gradually maneuvered them to going to Constantinople.
So it's a bit like the March of the 10,000, where you don't let the rank and file know too much until until they're lining up for the big battle. One of the things I found, one of the reasons I wanted to talk about the Fourth Crusade, and it's one of the things I find most upsetting, and I feel a bit guilty that it upsets me so much, because, there's huge loss of life and human misery, but the physical destruction and all the libraries and all the art that presumably at this time, we're talking, 1204, so it's very close to making it down to the modern era. And what do you think we lost in terms of ancient literature, when, large parts of the city go up in flames then?
Oh, that is very hard to say. Certainly we lost something. There are, for example, ancient authors who we know, or ancient texts we know were being read still in the 12th century and then sort of disappear. So, it's a reasonable hypothesis to assume that they were lost in one of those fires. So there had been other fires in Constantinople. There's a very big conflagration just like 5 years before the Fourth Crusade, but also 3 more fires set by the Fourth Crusade. Ancient texts were lost, but also the ancient art that had been gathered up in Constantinople, 900 or 800 years earlier. And this is an important point to stress, because when Constantinople was founded by Constantine and by his successors who expanded the city and adorned it, they brought to it some of the more interesting or beautiful or famous works of art from all over the Eastern, certainly from the Aegean, but more broadly from the Eastern Mediterranean. The originals, right? And they also brought all of the texts, like they created libraries in Constantinople. The reason why we have ancient Greek literature at all is because it was preserved in Constantinople for all of those centuries and copied and studied and talked about, right? Now, most of that literature survives, not all of it. Some was destroyed, for example, in the Fourth Crusade. But the art is almost entirely gone. And we know that a lot of it was destroyed by the soldiers of the Fourth Crusade. We have an eyewitness who was there, Nikitas Choniatis, a historian, a high official of the empire, and he wrote a separate little work on all of the artworks that were destroyed at this time.
Oh.
Now, there had been some prestigious ancient art that had been destroyed or damaged by fires earlier. There's a major fire in the 5th century that destroyed a couple of collections of ancient art by famous sculptors, Praxiteles and so forth.
The statue of Zeus, is it?
Yeah, the Phidias statue of Zeus from Olympia. But there were other masterpieces that were destroyed then. So the odd result is that when we're talking about ancient literature, we tend to have the best of the best, or at least what ancient readers and Byzantine readers thought was the best. We have Homer, we have Thucydides, we have Plato, we have all of that. But when it comes to art, we have the second-rate stuff that was left behind in the provinces.
That's interesting. So you don't think we're missing, the books of Livy didn't go up in flames in the Fourth Crusade. We're not missing Aristotle because of these bastard Venetians.
So it's certainly not Livy, because that's a Latin text, and Constantinople did not preserve Latin literature, except maybe some legal texts. So not Livy. But your point is taken. Yes, there are ancient authors or ancient texts we don't have because they were destroyed in those fires, or just destroyed in the vandalism that happened afterwards. Yes, there are. Callimachus, perhaps.
But not to sort of start an argument at this late stage in the podcast, but is that not a strike against the East Romans when they say, "Oh, we're Romans, we're terribly Roman," and Latin literature, who cares?
No, I mean, they never said who cares. It's just that as a culture, it had lost Latin after about 600 or so. They never. I'm
trying to say they weren't sort of looking back to the works of Livy to sort of explain their history, is sort of what's slightly puzzling me. If they sort of perceive, if they I mean, maybe it's because they were Christians and they weren't looking back to the pagan origins of Rome.
No, they definitely looked back to pagan Rome. It was their history. This was part of their national history, and they preserved it. The thing is that they preserved it in Greek. In other words, think about it this way. Actually, even Livy, for parts of history, of Roman history that the East Romans were interested in, they had Livy's source, Polybius. In a certain sense, for many sections of his history, Livy is secondary. Constantinople had the original.
Right.
For the foundation of Rome, right, they had a whole huge book by Dionysius of Halicarnassus. So the question you have to ask yourself is, let's suppose you're a Roman historian today, right? You study ancient Rome. There's a reason why you need to know Greek as well as Latin, because Livy and Sallust and Tacitus are not sufficient. You also need to be able to read Polybius and Dionysius and Plutarch and Appian and Cassius Dio. And the reason that you need to do that is because these are ancient historians writing in Greek about Rome. And the reason we have them is because East Romans later on wanted to access their own Roman history, but needed to do so in Greek, and so they preserved those texts. Let me rephrase that. We have more ancient Roman history written in Greek than we do in Latin for this reason.
And perhaps we always did.
And perhaps there always was, yes. In fact, the first Roman historian ever, a guy called Fabius Pictor, who was a senator right after the Hannibalic War, Second Punic War. So he wrote the first Roman history, and he wrote it in Greek. In fact, of the first 10 Roman historians we know, I think at least 7 of them wrote in Greek.
Right.
So Latin and Roman are not the same thing. They're not like overlapping categories.
Okay.
Roman includes Greek.
Okay, I'll get back in my box.
No, it's a totally fair point. Yeah.
I'm sort of slightly dotting around at the moment, but there was something I found terribly interesting, is that, the policy of the Roman Empire was they were forever marrying off their daughters to, some vile barbarian out on the steppes. this marriage diplomacy. And I just could not see what was in it for them, because all they seemed to get out of it was some extremely unruly in-laws who suddenly were interested in Roman politics. So I just was wondering, what's the quid pro quo? I can see the barbarian, he's delighted he's got this sophisticated alliance, but what's in it for the Romans?
So this is a very rare occurrence before the 12th century or late 11th. Right? So for most of East Roman history, this is not something you normally do. There are some famous counterexamples. So for example, Basil II, late 10th century, marries his sister Anna off to Volodymyr of Kiev. What does he get out of it? Well, he gets 6,000 Varangian guardsmen, which enabled him to turn the tide against his enemies, the Phocas. Also, he gets Volodymyr's conversion to Christianity. And Anna is ostensibly sort of a source from which Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, spreads to the Rus. So that's what he got out of it. That's not a small thing. Sometimes you would get a military alliance. It could be a minor military alliance. It could be a major one. But it was really the Comneni in the 12th century who turned this kind of dynastic marriages into a matter of foreign policy. And I think, I mean, you're right, it turned out to be a disaster, especially when they brought in all these Western feudal lords into the extended imperial family, because as we said earlier, they started to invent titles for themselves and to have claims on Eastern Roman politics and territories. In retrospect, it would have been better had they not done so, bringing in all these, Marquis of Montferrat and all of these people. But yeah, I don't know that they could have known this at the time. But yeah, it did bring in all these meddlesome in-laws.
Okay, so we're gonna jump forward again. The Latin Empire, it lasts a surprisingly long time in Constantinople. It lasts, I think, what is it, something like 60 years, 70 years, something like that.
Something like that.
I mean, surprisingly long time. And the Roman Empire sort of still exists in some lands, and they're kind of split from each other. But one side of each side of the Bosphorus, there's still some sort of rump state existing. But eventually, they managed to push the Latins out of Constantinople, and that's almost a bad thing for the empire, in the sense that it now allows them to start civil wars amongst themselves. They're no longer got a common enemy. They're going to fight. They're going to fight each other. And you have a great line. In fact, I just say to people, the book is studded with extremely dry humor, and I appreciated it very much. But I don't know if it's your line about the fact that the Romans became spectators in their own civil wars, and that their role is just to start them.
Okay, so that's a line from the later 14th century, so well after the reconquest of Constantinople. Yeah, so this is when the Paleologi dynasty they have almost no territory left. I mean, by this point. But the different factions are bringing in, one is bringing in some Bulgarians, the others are bringing in the Turks, and the battle ends up being basically a battle between the Bulgarians and the Turks, where you're seeing, okay, no, so it's the fate of the Balkans that's being decided here. This is not just a Roman civil war. This is like looking to the future in a way, the Ottoman conquests. The Paleologi had a lot of civil wars. To explain why they had all those civil wars would take quite some time. I mean, it has to do with the fiscal organization of state properties. It's a rather technical. It's not that the Paleologi were sort of worse people necessarily. I mean, some of them were pretty awful. Some of them were fine, but there's a reason why they had all these factional disputes. The Latin Empire, it did last for a very long time, but it's not surprisingly long, because remember, it was housed in Constantinople. Constantinople is the most fortified place, very, very difficult to take. And I'll refer you back to the conversation we had about the geostrategic position of Constantinople. So if you control the fleet, and remember the Latin Empire was allied with the Venetians, and they could provide a fleet, and so could the Principality of Achaia in the Peloponnese. So whenever the Romans wanted to take Constantinople back, and they tried a number of times, they ran into the problem not only of the defenses of the city, but also that the Latins could muster a larger fleet. And that just, made it very hard to retake the city. And eventually they just decided to kind of wait it out because it had been reduced to literally the walls. Like the Latin Empire was literally nothing more than just the walls of Constantinople, whatever was inside the walls. And they managed to take it, but they took it by accident. No one was planning on it. This Roman general, Alexios Strategopoulos, was just kind of, he went up to the walls just to see what's happening, and there's no one defending them. And some locals approached, and these were local Romans, and they said, hey, like, we'd like you to take the city back, and we can show you how to get in. And he's like, okay. And the reason he was able to do that is because the Latin emperors, men and the fleet were off in the Black Sea on a separate expedition. And so the city was undefended because they knew that this is Michael Palaiologos, the Roman emperor, was not preparing a naval expedition against Constantinople, so they were not prepared for one. They were not, however, expecting Strategopoulos to show up with 500 guys who just passed through or over the walls. We're not sure how they got in. Anyway, so it was an accident, but there's a reason why it lasted for so long, and that reason is Constantinople. It's not anything else.
And the empire, I don't know to what extent we should take it down to the last days. I mean, I don't think we should. We definitely shouldn't try and talk about the politics and the ins and outs. Otherwise, it's another 5 podcasts will sail by. But it lasts such a long time after that. I mean, it lasts almost another 200 years before the final fall of the city. That's almost the length of time the British Empire was around. I mean, it's incredible that last days of Constantinople are, for many empires, is about as long as they would last. I mean, admittedly, as you say, it's now a much reduced part of the world.
Yeah. Well, this is actually an excellent point on which to leave the audience with, that this is an extraordinarily resilient polity. There are very, very few, if any, in history that have survived for so long under such difficult conditions. Because we're not talking about Portugal or Japan or even Britain, which are not surrounded by enemies. We're talking about the most critical nexus point between Europe and Asia for a millennium of history that was the most difficult and dangerous for any state to exist in. And yet they managed to survive. It's the only state that managed to do this. And I think this calls for a separate discussion. I'm writing a separate little book on this question, and it'll be a mini graph. In other words, very short, like 30,000 words. And I'm going to call it the success and longevity of the Eastern Roman state. Like, why did it last for so long? This points us to a model that is an alternative to the decline and fall model.
Right.
I think it's preposterous to identify a society, a state with a continual history of almost over 1,100 years with the concepts of decline and fall. Yeah, it's just on the face of it ridiculous. This is the very model of longevity and resilience and the ability to bounce back. Every time they get hit by one of these, just out of the blue, catastrophes, the Arab invasions, the Seljuk invasions, this Fourth Crusade, whatever, events that they could never have foreseen or realistically even planned for. Mass migration of Turkmen from Central Asia. Like, why would anybody be prepared for that, right? Okay.
How do you prepare?
How? Yeah. And it's also possible that these were just like attacks that they couldn't possibly have countered at the time. Nevertheless, after each one, including the Fourth Crusade, they regroup, they know what they're doing, and they lay down foundations for gradual recovery and growth. Every time. Now, the last phase after after the 13th century, it gets cut short pretty quickly. But you can see that it's on the way back. Michael Palaiologos had reconstituted most of the Komnenian Empire. He basically put it together again, most of it, and laid the foundation for the recovery of the Peloponnese and so forth. So the question then is, what enables this society every time to start the process of recovery and economic and demographic growth that sometimes lasts centuries? Why do we associate it with the moments of weakness and failure? Failures on the battlefield, which are, random sometimes, and not with the majority of its history, which are precise trajectories of growth. So I want to draw attention to those periods and try to explain what the sort of inner sources of that kind of resilience and growth are. That's a very interesting topic, I find, just abstractly, but also in all of the concrete particulars that it plays out.
I'm going to finish with a slightly more upbeat question. So I want to assume that you've been cast adrift by Chicago University, God forbid, but you're going to start a new life as a writer of racy historical novels. So which part of the history of the Eastern Empire would you use as the backdrop to your series of best-selling novels?
Racy? Do they have to be racy?
They can be as calm and whatever's selling well. But what period do you think would make a good setting for a series of good historical novels? Seriously.
So let's assume that these novels need to be commercial somewhat, right? Because you can write a good novel about anyone, anywhere, if you have a good story and good characters and good writing. So first of all, I'll stay away from Theodora. I'm tired of the Theodora industry. So let's just shelve that. So I think that the 11th and 12th centuries, so the Komnenian period, is fascinating and would be commercially viable and marketable because you've got East and West meeting in all kinds of ways. You have crusades, and you have a kind of dashing aristocratic culture that is, so the Komneni, like Manuel in particular, a warrior emperor, womanizer, very intelligent, charismatic ruler with almost infinite money to, just kind of broadcast his primacy, as he saw it, among the kings of Christendom, and not only. And you've got a lot of intrigue and great literature and some very intelligent philosophers and scholars. You have the greatest Homer scholar of the whole Middle Ages living in Constantinople at the time. So I think that would be just a fascinating period. With lots of those different kind of characters. So kind of different from the more dour, pious, sort of kind of monastery-oriented emperors of the 9th and 10th centuries sometimes. I don't think they were like that, but that's the image that they like to project.
Well, hopefully nobody's listening that will steal your idea. So they'll.
Oh, no, I hope they do. I hope they do. I'm never going to do this. I don't think I have the skills.
Yeah, different skills.
Imaginative fiction. I just end up anyway. I never actually tried. I thought about it. I had planned out a novel that was set in 626, during the siege of Constantinople by the Avars and the Persians. So this is another one of these. The last great war of antiquity is.
But I think sieges are great for novels.
Yes, they are.
Because everything is concentrated to one point, and there's a point of tension coming up. So I think that's where you and I are going to have to collaborate on this new project.
I had planned it out. I had thought out the characters. I had fleshed out the personalities of people like the Patriarch Sergius and other characters I made up. I was into the idea of it, but the thing is, I just couldn't produce viable fictional prose. I just can't do like dialogue and the pacing and the flashbacks and the whatever. I'm I'm for structured argumentation.
Right.
So I'm going to.
There's a novel. I mean, it's beneath your dignity, really, but there's a writer of. I don't know if you're familiar with the Sharp series, sort of British soldier. There's a guy called Bernard Cornwell writes this long series.
I've seen them. Yes.
Yeah, but I think his masterpiece is, if that's probably too strong a word for what is basically popular historical fiction, but he wrote a 3-part book about King Arthur and Merlin. But he sets it in, I guess, the early 500s, and he makes it historical. So nothing is happening that could not be justified by reference to what we think we understand about what was going on at the time. So you've got the Britons and the Saxons, and Merlin is just a druid, and nothing he does, well, is it supernatural? It can be explained either way, and it's sort of, I think it's very brilliantly constructed because you can then see where all the myths came from.
Right.
But there's no myth there. There's no magic there.
I had read or started to read some novels that he wrote about Anglo-Saxon England and Alfred.
Yeah, that's the Uther ones. I don't think they're so good. They're a bit
Yeah. They were definitely oriented toward the more teenage audience that wanted Vikings and whatever. The reason I started to read them was because there's a trope in those kinds of books that eventually someone will end up in Constantinople. So these novels about Vikings, at some point, someone's going to go to Constantinople, and I want to see what that looks like. But they weren't for me.
No, I can. I wasn't a fan particularly because I felt always it was almost the same plot point.
Yes.
Anyway, let's not waste too much time on that. Anyway, look, Anthony, I'm going to let you go because that's been absolutely fantastic, and thank you so much for being so generous with your time. I really, really appreciate it, and I really enjoyed the book. And as I say, there's a lot of sly humor in it, and just terrific. So thank you so much. Is there anything else that you want to sort of say before we close off, or are we about done?
So I'm glad you picked up on the humor because I did not want this to be a dry textbook. I wanted it to be also entertaining in addition to informative. So I'm glad you saw that. And thank you for having me on. It was a pleasure to be here. We'll just refer the audience to the book if they want to learn more about everything that we've talked about.
Yeah, although we've done, I don't know what it is, an hour and a half or even a bit more. Sure. This is the whole history from start to finish, and it's absolutely fantastic. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Okay, that's the end of the podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. I think Anthony Kaldellis was an absolutely fantastic guest, and I really recommend his book, The New Roman Empire. If you have a serious interest in Byzantium, then it's a fantastic book. So I hope you enjoyed the show, and please, if you can, leave a review on Apple Podcasts. That would be absolutely fantastic. And see you next time.